Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, where we kind of dig into that whole creativity and mental illness thing.
Always a fascinating topic, right?
Totally. And this time, we're looking at this book, The Bipolar Express. It's all about artists and bipolar disorder, and, well, it really gets you thinking.
I mean, has there ever been an artist who wasn't at least a little bit different?
Right. But this book, it doesn't just scratch the surface. It opens with this story about Charlie Chaplin and how he was abandoned by his mom.
Oh, I remember that. She had bipolar disorder, right?
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking, but it also kind of makes you see his work in a new light. Like, he took that pain and turned it into the little tramp, that character who's funny, but also kind of sad.
It's like maybe genius isn't just about being mad, but about turning those tough experiences into something that speaks to everyone.
Exactly. Okay, but let's back up a bit. The book takes us back to the early days of film, like way back. And honestly, some of the ways mental illness was shown back then, oof, not great.
Well, yeah, back then people didn't really understand mental illness. It was something to be afraid of, not something you talked about.
Yeah, like, remember that film, The Escaped Lunatic? They
Yeah.
basically just made fun of people in asylums.
Not exactly subtle, is it? I mean, thankfully, things have changed a lot since then.
Oh, for sure. But even back then, some filmmakers were trying to do better. The book talks about this Japanese film, A Page of Madness.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It used all these surreal images and stuff to show what it was like inside the mind of someone in an asylum.
Right. Super groundbreaking for its time.
Definitely.
And then there's Hexen, this 1922 film that said, hey, maybe those accused of witchcraft were just, mentally ill. And it's society that's actually cruel.
Wow, that's pretty radical for back then, like way ahead of its time.
Right. And speaking of people ahead of their time, the book talks about W.K.L. Dixon. He was like a total pioneer in early cinema.
Oh, yeah, I know him. Wait, was he the one who...
Invented the mutoscope. Yep, that was him.
Yeah.
And he probably had bipolar disorder.
Seriously? I had no idea.
I know, right? It's like all those ups and downs, those manic periods, could that have actually helped his creativity?
I mean, some people say that manic energy can lead to incredible productivity.
Right. So wait, are we saying every great artist is secretly bipolar?
No, not at all. But this book, it shows us that maybe there's a connection between mental illness and creativity that's, well, a little more complicated than we thought.
Okay, I'm totally hooked now. So tell me more about these artists in the book. Like, what about Chaplin? How did his mom's illness actually affect his work?
Well, you see that recurring theme in his films, the one where he's always trying to rescue these troubled women.
Yeah.
A lot of people think that's him trying to save his mother, in a way.
Wow, that's really powerful.
It is, and Chaplin's just the beginning. This book, it looks at all these directors and actors, and you can see how their struggles, their bipolar disorder, it kind of comes out in their work.
Like Orson Welles, right?
Yeah.
That guy was larger than life.
Oh, yeah. Wells, manic energy, huge ambitions, then crushing depression. Sounds familiar, right?
So, like, are we saying every ambitious person has bipolar disorder? Where do we draw the line?
That's the tricky part, isn't it? We can't just diagnose everyone. But with Wells, I mean, come on. Citizen Kane, that whole movie feels like a study of bipolar disorder.
It's true. You can see those parallels.
Mm-hmm.
And what about Jean Tierney? She was so talented, but had a really rough time.
Yeah, she had depression, but it took them forever to figure out what was wrong. Imagine how tough that must have been, especially back then.
It's heartbreaking. And she actually talked about acting as a way to deal with her pain. She called it Novocaine for the mind.
Wow, Novocaine for the mind. That's pretty intense.
It is, and it makes you wonder, are some artists drawn to their work because it helps them cope?
It's possible. Maybe for some, creativity is like a way to self-medicate.
Interesting. So what about Nicholas Ray, the guy who directed Rebel Without a Cause? The book says he dealt with bipolar disorder his whole life.
Yeah, and his films, they're so full of emotion,
Yeah.
That feeling of being lost, of not belonging. You can see his own struggles in those themes.
Like he's trying to figure things out through his art.
Exactly. And that's what a lot of these artists do. They're not just making movies for fun. They're grappling with big questions, about life, about suffering.
And maybe they're saying, hey, I'm dealing with this and you might be too. Let's try to understand it together.
That's a great way to put it. It's about that shared human experience.
Okay, so we've talked about Chaplin, Wells, Tierney, and Ray. What about someone like, I don't know, Akira Kurosawa? I mean, he's known for those dark, epic films.
Right, Kurosawa. He really went deep into those dark places, and a lot of that came from his own struggles with depression.
Yeah, he even considered suicide at one point.
Exactly. And you see that epic despair in films like Rana, right? It's a Shakespearean tragedy set in feudal Japan, and the main character just completely falls apart mentally. It's incredibly powerful and really honest, but tough to watch.
Yeah, it's intense.
Hmm.
But his films aren't all doom and gloom, you know. They're beautiful too, and hopeful in a way. Like he's saying, even when things are bad, there's still something worth fighting for.
I like that. It's about that resilience, that spark of hope, even in the darkest of times. And it shows that suffering can actually fuel creativity. It's not about romanticizing mental illness, but recognizing how it shapes these incredible artistic visions.
So I guess what we're learning is that the whole mad genius thing, it's not so simple, right?
Right. It's not black and white. It's messy and complicated and fascinating.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so many more filmmakers and stories to explore, and I can't wait to dive in.
And of course, we can't talk about these big director personalities without talking about Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola, The Godfather, Apocalypse Now. I mean, the guy's a legend.
Total legend.
Yeah.
And guess what? The Bipolar Express kind of hints that his creative process, it might have been tied to bipolar disorder too.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, right? All those incredible films in the 70s, but also, like, the stories about the pressure, the breakdowns. It's like a movie itself.
I know, it's crazy. He made The Godfather, The Conversation, Godfather Part 2, and Apocalypse Now, all within, like, what, 5 years?
It's insane. And it seems like with Apocalypse Now especially, his struggles, they kind of bled into the film itself. That production was notoriously difficult, you know? Coppola was pushing everyone, including himself, to the limit.
Wait, are you saying making Apocalypse Now was almost as crazy as the actual Vietnam War?
Well, I'm not saying it was exactly the same, but there are definitely some parallels. Coppola put everything into that film, and it almost destroyed him. But the result? A masterpiece. A film that really captures the horrors of war and, what it does to a person's mind.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. It's like, maybe you need a little bit of madness to make truly great art.
It's a question that's hard to answer, but Coppola's story, it definitely suggests that there can be a fine line between genius and, self-destruction.
Yeah, that's a good point. And speaking of walking that line, we have to talk about Heath Ledger. His performance as the Joker in The Dark Knight is, well, unforgettable.
Absolutely. And the book makes this chilling connection between Ledger's own struggles, his bipolar disorder and insomnia, and, well, the Joker's whole chaotic, destructive personality.
It's kind of scary, actually, how much he got into that role. Like, he really went deep.
Yeah, Ledger was all about method acting. He immersed himself in his roles, and, well, sometimes it took a toll on him. And with the Joker, it seems like he tapped into some really dark parts of himself.
It's fascinating, but also sad. You can feel that raw emotion in his performance, that unhinged energy. But it makes you wonder what it did to him, you know?
It's a reminder that great art can come at a cost. It's like a cautionary tale about pushing yourself too far, about blurring the lines between what's real and what's not. And it makes you ask yourself, how much are we willing to sacrifice for art?
That's a heavy question. But, okay, so far, we've been talking about how these artists' struggles might have influenced their work. But what about how mental illness is actually portrayed on screen? Has that changed much over time?
Oh, definitely. The Bipolar Express goes through that whole evolution. From the early days when mental illness was mostly portrayed in a really simplistic, often insensitive way, to more recent films that are way more nuanced and compassionate.
Yeah, it's true. Thinking back to those early films we talked about, like The Escaped Lunatic, it's kind of hard to watch now, right? They were just playing mental illness for laughs.
Yeah, it shows how far we've come in understanding and accepting mental illness. Today, there are way more films that go beyond those simple stereotypes and try to show the real human experience.
Exactly. I mean, compare something like A Page of Madness to a film like Silver Linings Playbook. It's like night and day.
Right. So what do you think? What changed?
Well, I guess mental health awareness has come a long way, right? And there are more filmmakers who are, willing to tackle these issues with sensitivity.
Yeah, definitely. And the book talks about some key examples of those filmmakers who are pushing for more honest portrayals. Like there's that documentary, The Devil and Daniel Johnston.
Oh, I love that one. It's so raw, so real. It doesn't shy away from the dark side of his illness, but it also celebrates his music, his resilience.
Exactly. It's a great example of a film that treats its subject with respect and compassion. And then you have something like Silver Linings Playbook, a fictional story, but still, It manages to be funny and heartwarming while showing what it's like to live with bipolar disorder.
Yeah, and it gives people hope, you know? It shows that recovery is possible, that you can find love and connection even when things are tough.
It's a good reminder that there's always hope. But of course, there are still problematic portrayals out there too, right? The book calls those out too.
So, like, what are some of the traps filmmakers still fall into?
Well, there's that whole manic pixie dream girl trope, for one.
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean. Those quirky, spontaneous female characters who, like, come into the protagonist's life and shake things up.
Exactly. They're portrayed as free spirits, but their craziness is often just a plot device, you know? It's played for laughs or to help the male character grow.
Right, and it ignores the real struggles that people with mental illness face. It's like they're not just quirky characters. They're real people with real problems.
Exactly. And another common trap is portraying mental illness as inherently violent or dangerous.
Yeah, like Norman Bates in Psycho.
Exactly. Now, Psycho is a classic, but it does play into that harmful stereotype that people with mental illness are, ticking time bombs.
Right, which is just not true. Most people with mental illness are not violent at all.
Exactly. So, how do we move beyond these stereotypes? How do we get more nuanced, more authentic portrayals of mental illness on screen?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
I think it starts with listening to people with lived experience. We need more writers, directors, actors who actually understand mental illness, who can tell those stories from a place of truth.
And we as viewers need to be more critical, Call out those harmful stereotypes and demand better representation.
Absolutely. It's a collective effort. We can't just sit back and wait for things to change.
It's funny. We're talking about all this in a podcast about the mad genius idea. Aren't we kind of, perpetuating the myth ourselves?
That's a good point. The term mad genius itself can be problematic, right? It kind of romanticizes mental illness and suggests that creativity somehow depends on suffering.
So, like, what are we really trying to say here?
I think we're just trying to have an honest conversation to explore that complex relationship between creativity and mental illness without oversimplifying it.
Right. We're not saying that one causes the other or that all great artists are mentally ill.
We're just saying that mental illness is part of the human experience and it can show up in art just like it shows up in every other part of life.
And it's important to talk about it with sensitivity and empathy and, to be open to challenging our own assumptions.
Exactly. And it's interesting to think about how those early films, even the ones with problematic portrayals, they kind of paved the way for better representations later on.
Right. Like, we've come a long way, but it's been a gradual process, and it shows how art can be a force for change, It can challenge stereotypes and help people understand each other better.
Absolutely. It's a conversation that's still going on, and we need to keep talking about it.
And the Bipolar Express is a great contribution to that conversation. It's a reminder that things are complicated, that there's always more to learn.
Totally. It's a book that makes you think, and that's a good thing.
It's definitely made me want to rewatch some of those films with a fresh perspective.
Me too. And you know what else I find fascinating? The way some of these films use visuals, like metaphors, to represent mental illness.
Oh, yeah, like the distorted perspectives and shadows in Caligari.
Exactly. Or like water imagery in films about depression. It's like they're tapping into our deepest fears and anxieties.
It's powerful stuff. And it makes you wonder if, on some level, we're all drawn to these stories because they reflect something universal about being human.
Maybe we all have our own moments of madness, right? Times when we feel lost or overwhelmed or like we just don't fit in. And maybe these films help us process those emotions, help us feel less alone.
That's a beautiful thought. And it makes me think about how important it is to share our stories, to break down the stigma around mental illness, and to build a world where everyone feels supported.
Well said. I think that's a perfect place to leave it. As we've been talking about these filmmakers, it's striking how many of them were kind of like outsiders. They didn't quite fit in.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, is that connected to their creativity?
That's interesting. The book does touch on that, like how the whole bipolar experience, those intense highs and lows can make you feel alienated, like you don't belong.
Yeah, it's like they're on a different wavelength, experiencing the world in a way most people don't. And that can be exciting, but also really lonely.
Right. And that feeling of being different, of being other, could that actually drive creativity?
It could. I mean, think about it. When you don't fit in, you're more likely to question things, to see the world differently, and to express yourself in unique ways.
Okay, that makes sense. But it also sounds kind of dangerous, like being constantly out of sync with everyone else. That could lead to some serious loneliness, maybe even despair.
Oh, definitely. It's a double-edged sword. That same sensitivity, that intensity that can fuel creativity can also make you more vulnerable to mental health struggles. It's a tough balance.
The book talks about this in relation to some films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, that old German expressionist film, with the hypnotist and the sleepwalker who commits murders.
Oh, yeah, Caligari. That's a creepy one.
It's really unsettling, but also fascinating.
Yeah.
And it explores this idea of mental illness as like a social contagion, something that can spread and disrupt the whole order of society.
Caligari is definitely a product of its time. I mean, it came out right after World War I, so there was all this anxiety about, social upheaval and what it means to be normal.
Right, those distorted visuals, the shadowy figures, it creates this feeling of unease, like madness is lurking beneath the surface of everyday life.
Exactly. It plays on that fear of the other, of people who don't conform, and that fear can be really powerful. It can lead to all sorts of problems like prejudice, discrimination, even violence.
It's like society needs to label certain people as mad in order to feel safe. And then you have Hitchcock's Psycho, which taps into those same fears. Norman Bates, the seemingly normal motel owner who turns out to be, well, a deeply disturbed killer.
Psycho is a masterpiece, but it does perpetuate that stereotype of the mentally ill person as dangerous.
It's definitely scary. But it's important to remember it's just a movie. It's not real life.
Right. We can't let those cinematic representations define our understanding of mental illness. Mental illness is not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's complex, and people who experience it are incredibly diverse.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about films that present mental illness as something to be afraid of. But what about films that offer a more, empathetic view?
Well, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a great example. It's a powerful critique of how society treats people who are different, who don't fit the mold.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic. With Jack Nicholson as McMurphy, that whole rebellion against Nurse Ratched and the system.
Exactly. It challenges us to see the humanity in people who are labeled as mad or crazy.
And to question who's really in control, right? Like, maybe the real threat isn't the individual, but the system itself.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the Bipolar Express doesn't just focus on these older films. It also looks at how mental illness is portrayed in more recent cinema.
And how's that going?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest. There are some really moving, insightful films out there, but then there are others that, fall back on those same tired tropes and stereotypes.
Yeah, like that manic pixie dream girl trope we talked about. It feels like that one never really goes away.
It's frustrating, isn't it? But there are also filmmakers who are breaking new ground, creating characters and stories that are both authentic and complex. It's exciting to see.
So what films give you hope for the future of mental health representation?
Well, we talked about The Devil and Daniel Johnston, and I think that's a great example of a film that gets it right. It's honest, it's empathetic, and it celebrates Johnston's creativity without shying away from his struggles.
Yeah, it's a really powerful film. And then there are films like Silver Linings Playbook and Perks of Being a Wallflower, which show that recovery is possible, that people with mental illness can have fulfilling lives.
Right, and it's so important to see those stories on screen, to challenge the stigma and give people hope.
Totally agree. And it's not just about showing mental illness realistically, it's also about celebrating neurodiversity, showing that there are many different ways of experiencing the world, and that's okay.
Absolutely. And the Bipolar Express reminds us that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to mental health. What works for one person might not work for another, and it's important to respect individual differences and choices.
This whole conversation has been really eye-opening, and I'm honestly feeling pretty inspired right now.
Me too. It's a good reminder that art can be a powerful force for change, for healing, and for connection. And we all have a role to play in creating a more inclusive and understanding world.
That's a great point. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Bipolar Express. We hope it's given you some new perspectives on the relationship between creativity and mental illness.
And remember, if you or someone you know is struggling, there's help out there. Don't be afraid to reach out.
That's so important. And until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and keep the conversation going.